6, the New Testament. This is, it's interesting how some people had multiple encounters with angels. Paul only has one, just one. This is the one that takes place. And it's at the end of the book of Acts. So you come way to the end of the book of Acts after everything else took place in his life. Not even the beginning of his life, right towards the end. And in Acts chapter 26, we're going to read some of this. Let's see. I don't want to go through all of that. Okay, let's go to Acts chapter 27. 26 is a background of how Paul ended up in the situation. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. That's a band of soldiers, not a music group. And entering a ship of Adoniratum, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. And when he had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And when he had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete, over against Salome. And hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lycia. So far everything is pretty calm. Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be hurt and much damage, not only of the landing and ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence, and if by any means they might attain to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete, and lieth toward the south, west, and northwest. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Claudia, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. And we, being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was taken away. We'll go back and find out what happens. So, as we look here, we meet the guy named Paul. Most people are familiar with Paul if you're watching Comcast or YouTube, Comcast or YouTube. And you're not familiar with who he was. His given name was Saul, just like the first king of Israel. It's a Jewish name. He was given the name Saul. He was from Tarshish. Acts chapter 9, verse 11 tells us that. It's a center of learning in Asia Minor. Think of east of Turkey. Okay, so you're east of Turkey, in that area over there. He was a Roman citizen. That's a unique thing. Most Jews are not citizens. That means he came from an affluential family, and he tells us he was actually born a Roman citizen. Very few Jews had that privilege. He also told us he was a student of Gamaliel. Does anybody remember Gamaliel? Right after Christ died, and they arrested Peter and John, and they wanted to kill them, Gamaliel said, "Leave them alone." He said, if what they say is true, you cannot fight against it. That is Paul's teacher, Gamaliel. He was very zealous, he told us. That means he was really on fire for his religion. In Acts chapter 22, verse 20, it says that he oversaw the execution of Stephen. So when Stephen, the first of the martyrs, the one who was killed and stoned to death, he was a deacon, Paul was in charge of that. He vigorously persecuted Christians in Acts 22, verse 4. In fact, it says he arrested men and women alike. And so he's the first to lead the persecution of Christians. And then in Acts chapter 22, he says this. We can go back and take a look at that, verses 6 through 11, to see. Because in this whole story, he tells this story 3 times. So in Acts chapter 22, verses 6 through 11, he says, "And it came to pass," this is while he's going to kill Christians, "as I made my journey and was come nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light about me. And I fell unto the ground and heard the voice saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And they that were with me saw indeed the light, and were afraid, but heard not the voice of him that spake to me. And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said unto me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there shall be told thee of all things which are appointed for thee to do. And when I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of them that were with me, I came into Damascus. And it was there in Damascus that he met Ananias, and there that he found Christ as his Savior. God changed his life. Dramatic conversion. Later we find he says that what happened then, he went back to Tarsus. He's studying the Bible now for like 3 years. A lot of people immediately get into ministry. All the disciples did, not Paul. Paul went back and he's studying the Bible. He's gone. He disappears. And then a man by the name of Barnabas goes to get him. Barnabas also had another name. His name was Joseph Barnabas. You may remember him. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Christ. So Barnabas goes and gets him, brings him back, and then the church at Antioch in Acts chapter 13, verse 2, send out Barnabas and Saul as their first missionaries. So they go out. He took numerous missionary trips, mainly through Asia. We need to understand. I remember Dr. Abraham, one of my professors, said, people talk about Christianity being a Western religion. It is not. It's an Asian religion. It's an Asian. It started in the Middle East, just like Judaism and Islam later. It's all in the Middle East. And all the missionary trips are to Asia. And then what happened in Acts chapter 13, Paul told the story of how they were on their missionary trip, and then so Acts chapter 13 is where they said, separate Paul and Barnabas to me. And then in Acts chapter 16, things changed. Paul's been going, reaching Jews, reaching Gentiles, by the way. He's going out to Gentiles in Asia Minor, Turkey, and the northern parts of the Middle East. And then it said in verse 6 of chapter 16, now when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia. Galatia is in the eastern part of Turkey. It was a province. And the people in Galatia were different than the rest of the people from the area. Everybody wore just like this. They wore, they wore the gown type of things. Galatians wore trousers. It was very unique. And the Galatians migrated west. You would pronounce their name the Galatians. They are the ancestors of the Gaelic people. These are the ancestors of the Scotch and the Irish. And so Paul goes there, and it says they were forbidden of the Holy Ghost to preach the word there. Wait a minute, God told them you can't preach here? And after they would come to Mysia, they say to go into Bithynia. That's another part in the area. But the Spirit suffered them not. Why is God not letting them go to these towns? And they, passing by Mixe, came to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia. Do you remember Macedonia? You ever hear of Macedonia in a history lesson? Remember Alexander the Great? Alexander the Great, the Greek conqueror, his father's name was Philip of Macedonia. This is Greece. And this man prayed him, saying, "Come over into Macedonia and help us." And after he'd seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia, assuredly gathering that the Lord had called for us to preach the gospel unto them. So he's trying to go reach all these people over here. You know, we have too many people in America just preaching the gospel here, nobody going overseas. You know, that's why. Do you realize I told you only 10% of the world's population speaks English? 90% of all Christian workers, 90% of all Christian workers minister to that 10% of the world's population. The other 10% minister to the other 90 out there. So God says, you go there to Europe. It was the Apostle Paul who wrote most of the New Testament. He wrote them as letters. They were written as letters to the churches, to people. And he had a health problem. Have you ever had some health problems? There's a lot of people, these prosperity theology people, will try to tell you, you know, if you're sick, it's sin, and God will heal you. There were people over the years, I grew up with people like that, Oral Roberts, Catherine Kuhlman, Joel Osteen, and a bunch of the people like that. It's all this power positive type thinking thing. Well, the Apostle Paul right here tells us he had a health problem. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, in verse 7, it says, "And lest I be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations that there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." So he has this physical infirmity that the devil's troubling him. "For this thing I besought the Lord thrice." That's 3 times. He said, "God, please help me this." Now, don't you think, if supposedly everybody's supposed to get healed, wouldn't Paul have gotten healed? The very messenger of the gospel to the Gentiles. He said, "I prayed thrice that it might depart from me. And the Lord said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." So Paul's response, "Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I will take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." Sometimes we have to have difficulties before we depend on God. And Paul said, hey, God keeps working through me, and to keep me humble, to help me depend more on him, God gave me this physical ailment. In fact, Paul's partner, as he traveled the latter years in his ministry, was a physician. He had a doctor travel with him because of his problems. The doctor's name was Luke. Luke later wrote the Gospel of Luke. So he had this problem, and he was willing to put his life in danger for the gospel. Look in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 2 Corinthians 11, verse 23. It starts there, and Paul talks about, you think you've had it hard as a Christian sometimes, or you think your life's been difficult? Listen to what Paul said here. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. It talks about these people. "Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more, in labors more abundant, in stripes above measure." What does stripes mean? They're beating you with a whip. "In prisons more frequent, in deaths often. Of the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes save 1. 40 stripes. You know why they gave 40 lashes would kill somebody. So often they gave 39, 1 short of killing you. He said, it happened to me 5 times. "Thrice was I beaten with rods." Whoa. I mean, picture metal rods people are beating you with. "Once was I stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and day I have been in the deep." That means for a day and a half, he was in the water, after one of those shipwrecks, and survived. You want to talk about being scared. "In journeyings often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren." He couldn't get away from it. "In weakness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness." Those are some of the things that he went through just for the gospel. He was willing to put his life in danger. And he was almost beaten to death 5 times. The rods, 3 times, that would have killed you. In fact, one time, it appears, he died. They took him out to the edge of the city, and the wording used there in Hebrew is basically, he died. But then, he was so stubborn, he got back up again. In fact, he talked about it later and talked about he actually went to see heaven. And he said, I was in a strait betwixt two. He said, I wanted to stay there, but it was more mindful for me to be here. So God said, you go back. You still got a job to do. Whoa. That's pretty tough. That's this guy we're talking about here. So finally, Paul returns to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where his ministry started, and that's where he started killing people. When he gets there, before he got there, in Acts chapter 21, there was a prophet by the name of Agabus who warned him and said, if you go back to Jerusalem, you're going to be imprisoned. And Paul would not listen to the people. He says, God, I want to go to Rome, but I got to go to Jerusalem first. And so he goes to Jerusalem, and in Acts chapter 21, 23 to 26, there's a few guys that are going to go to the temple. They're taking a vow. He joins them in taking a vow. He shaves his head. Now, wait a minute. This is the New Testament. Why is he going to the temple? Because it's one of the places where they acknowledged God and they worshiped God. And so he went along with a cultural practice to honor God. So what happens, he gets there and he's falsely accused and almost beaten to death. The Jews see him there and they said, hey, wait, isn't this the guy that's been with the Gentiles? Yeah, one of those guys he brought here was a Gentile. No, he wasn't. He just went with 4 of the Jews. But they falsely accused him and almost beaten to death. And then in Acts chapter 21, we can follow along because we're going to jump through these things quickly to take you to why this is significant, what happens. In Acts chapter 21, right after they're about to beat him to death, in verse 30, and all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul, drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they were about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. So the one in charge of guarding everything, the Roman soldier in charge of the area, he hears about it, who immediately took soldiers and centurions. A centurion's over 100 men. He brought centurions plural, which means there's at least 200 or 300 soldiers coming, and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left the beating of Paul. And so the man that saved him, we find later, his name is Claudius Lysias. So Claudius Lysias and his Roman soldiers saved Paul. And then Paul gives his testimony, the very same thing we just read in the previous passage. He tells them his thing. So Lysias takes him back to the Roman guard, and he says, well, we're going to flog him and we'll get the truth out of him. And what happens there in verse 24, let's see, Romans chapter 21, 31. So they took Paul, and it says, and when, in verse 35, and when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. In other words, he's literally carried out of there by the soldiers. And the multitude of the people followed after, crying, away with him! And as Paul was led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? So apparently Paul is speaking in Greek while all the other Jews are speaking in Aramaic. Art thou not, and the Roman thinks this, art thou not that Egyptian, which before these days made an uproar and leadest out into the wilderness, and 4,000 men that were murderers? And Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarshish, a city of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. And then in verse 20, Paul gets to speak in the Hebrew tongue to the people. So all this is going on, and then in Acts chapter 22, they decide that, okay, let's take him away, and let's see if I can silence him, so I'm going to beat him. And it was just kind of to make the Jews happy. It says in verse 24, the chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging. Okay, so that they're going to beat him to try to find out what he was, why the people cried against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? Ooh. Paul uses his Roman citizenship now. He uses his legal rights to protect himself. When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, "Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman." Then the chief captain came and said unto him, "Tell me, art thou a Roman?" He said, "Yes." Yea, and the chief captain answered, "With a great sum obtained I this freedom." In other words, he paid for his citizenship, but I was freeborn. Paul was born as a Roman citizen, and he used that to protect his life. He used his Roman citizenship to stop a flogging. That gave him a legal advantage and an opportunity to further his ministry. So you do need to know what your rights are. Then they had Paul present his case before the Jewish leaders in Acts chapter 23. And we find in that chapter there are Sadducees and Pharisees. What's the difference between them? Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection. That's why they're sad, you see. And the Pharisees deal with all the details of the law. They think they're fair, you see. So that's what that's the two positions. You know what Paul did? He argued about a resurrection. He got half the crowd on his side. The Pharisees sided with him. And then they wanted to kill him again. In Romans 23, verse 10, and when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and to bring him into the castle. So the Roman soldiers save him again. Now here is something incredibly amazing. Paul's in the prison. We find he only has one encounter with an angel, but look what happens in verse 11. And the night following is while Paul's in prison, the Lord stood by him. This is Jesus who ascended up into heaven. He is now standing next to Paul in the prison, and he said, "Be of good cheer, Paul. For as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." So Paul's in prison. Guys have been trying to kill him. I says, "Hey, be happy. Don't worry. Be happy." No, and he says, "You're going to go to Rome, and you're going to testify of me." Can you imagine that? Well, they wanted to kill Paul. So what happened was, it says in verse 11, and the night following after that. Okay, so in verse 12, and when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And they were more than 40 which made this conspiracy. So 40 guys make a pledge that we're not going to eat or drink until Paul is dead. They plotted with the religious leaders. You realize politicians a lot of times will make dirty deals. They make dirty deals to get elected. They make dirty deals to stay in power, and sometimes they want to eliminate some people. Paul's nephew heard of this in Acts chapter 13, verse 16. He sent word to the Romans, and at 3 a.m. in the morning, the Romans sent Paul to Patterson. It's a city that's 37 miles away. They sent him with 470 soldiers. That's how serious the plot against Paul was. And when they get to Patterson, then they continued on to Caesarea with 70 horsemen. Now, I want to tell you something. Riding and walking, because you got to realize of the 470 men, 400 are on foot. They went 37 miles in one night. You know how hard that is to do? Anybody ever walked that far in one day? I walked 20 miles in one day. 22, I think it was, in one day. It took me a long, long time. That's amazing that he did this. And he was delivered to Felix. Remember Felix? Felix the cat, the wonderful one. No, it wasn't Felix the cat. Felix was the Roman governor. And they delivered it to him with a note explaining the whole thing, and Felix scheduled a hearing for 5 days later. So in Acts chapter 24, verses 1 through 9, so look at all this. It's going back and forth, back and forth. So now the Jewish leaders come up. It tells us in Acts chapter 24, verses 1 through 9, It says, and 5 days Ananias, the high priest, descended with the chief elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus. Do you remember the name Ananias? He's the man who tried to kill Jesus. He's the head. He was the chief priest. Then his son-in-law, Caiaphas, took over. Now here's Ananias again. He tried to kill, and he did kill Jesus. Now he wants to kill Paul. And they bring Tertullus, who's a Roman lawyer, and most likely in the court he argued in Latin, and the Jews couldn't do that. And then Paul made his defense, Acts chapter 24, verse 10 through 11. He gives his testimony again and talks about the resurrection. So then Felix delays the case under a legal point and waits for Claudius Lysias. Remember the captain? He's the one who witnessed everything. I'm going to wait for him to come, and then we'll deal with him. And it says he was guarded but given liberties. And then Felix and his wife, Drusilla, isn't that a good name? I think Disney used that for one of their characters. Drusilla, who was Jewish, they went to see him, and it says he was hoping Paul would give him a bribe. He was hoping Paul would pay him off and then to let him go, because Paul's a Roman citizen. He must have money. Look how wonderful the government was back then. Does that remind you of anything today? Well, the Bible says in Acts chapter 24, verse 7, that Felix kept Paul prisoner for 2 years. So the Roman soldier was too busy to come up and testify, so for 2 years, Paul is kept a prison there. And I put the little note in the notes. Did the 40 men who took the vow to kill Paul die? They said, we're not going to eat or drink till Paul's dead. Right? So did those 40 guys all starve to death? 40. I'm going to get you, Paul. And then finally, Porcius Festus replaces Felix in Acts chapter 25, verse 1. And the religious leaders asked Festus to send Paul to Rome in verse 2 through 3. It says, and the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem. Oh, isn't that nice? They want justice? Well, end of sentence. Laying in wait to kill him. Oh, yeah, send him back to Jerusalem so we can try him and kill him on the way. You know, they didn't tell Festus that. And so Festus said, no, you send your accusers to Caesarea. And it says in verse 6 through 8, they put many charges against him that they could not prove. Will you be falsely accused? Yes, that's what Jesus said. Will people lie about you? Yes, they will. Happens all the time. So in verse 9 of chapter 25, it says that, but Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? So Festus finally says, I'm going to give in to them. I'm going to let them take him. Go ahead, kill him on the way. And then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof they accuse me of, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Paul claimed the right of a Roman citizen to appear before Caesar himself. Well, the Bible tells us in Acts chapter 25, verse 12, the fourth Herod in the Bible. We talked about 4 Herods. This is the fourth one. Herod Agrippa II came to see Paul, and he wanted to listen to him, wanted to hear him, what he had to say. And we find in chapter 26, in verse 28, then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. The fourth of the Herods says, you almost persuaded me to be a Christian. Almost isn't enough. So what's the context of this passage? Acts chapter 27. Paul is now on his way to Rome as a prisoner. We read that at the beginning of the service, under Julius the centurion. The trip to Rome is by sea. They encountered many delays along the way, and then they sailed through dangerous seas. Have you ever been in a ship in bad weather? Anyone here been in a ship in bad weather? Isn't it a pleasant experience? Not at all. Not at all. And you say, oh, it's just the Mediterranean. I was a speedboat driver on Schroon Lake, And we got out in the middle of a couple storms, and the storms literally picked our ship up and threw it. I mean, our lives were in jeopardy. My grandfather was a sea captain. He was shipwrecked twice. In fact, one time he was shipwrecked on the Isle of Patmos, where John was banished, before he became a believer. And his father drowned. He was a fisherman. That's my great-grandfather drowned. His father drowned. His father drowned. These are professional seamen. The sea is dangerous. And so they're encountering these dangerous things. And they land in Crete, that's point 7 here. And Paul warned them of the dangers. Paul said, hey, I don't think we should go any further because it's dangerous. But Julius listened to the captain and disregarded Paul's warning. And it says at first they set out, and it was smooth, but then this powerful storm hit, which we read about. Powerful storm. And things looked very bleak. They're throwing the rigging off. That's how you control the ship. They're trying to make the ship light so they can be safe. And then finally, Paul tells them about his encounter with an angel in verse 21. And it says, but after long abstinence, Paul hasn't been speaking for days, which is really odd for Paul. You'll find out in the Bible. Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. Well, that doesn't help, right? You should have listened to me. But then he goes on. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer. You're in the middle of a storm. Your ship is being tossed about. You've had to throw your provisions. You've had to throw everything overboard to save your lives. And then he says, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. In other words, he says, don't worry. Guys, hey, he's been quiet. He says, okay, you should have listened to me. You didn't listen to me, but I want you to know something. You're all going to live, but the ship's going to be destroyed. Huh. How does he know that? For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar. Well, that means you're going to live. But wait, the angel went on and said, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit we must cast upon a certain island. And so he says, okay. Angel comes to him and says, you're going to see Caesar. Nobody's going to die, but the ship's going to be lost, and you're going to land on a certain island. Certain island. We'll find out what that island was in a moment. Well, on the 14th night, verse 27, when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to the country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they'd gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon a rock, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. And the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship when they let down the boat into the sea, under color, as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. In other words, the guy in charge of the ship and all the sailors are sneaking away. They go to get into this lifeboat, and Paul tells them, no, don't do that. And then Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Those guys want to save themselves. You know, sometimes you try to save ourselves, it doesn't work. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. Now there's no lifeboat. I'm on the Titanic, and there's no lifeboat. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat. You're in the middle of this bad storm where your stomach's going all crazy, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. In other words, they haven't eaten for 2 weeks. That's how bad it is. And when I pray thee to take some meat, for this is for your health, and for there shall not any hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were some of them of good cheer? No, all of good cheer. all the people on the ship. You know how many there were? 276 people. That's a big ship. 276 people, haven't eaten for 2 weeks. Paul says, let's eat now. And he gives thanks to God in the middle of the storm, because God said they're going to get through it. And when we were all in the ship, 216 souls, and when they had eaten enough, they lighted the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. That's the end of the food. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into which they were minded, if it possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind, and made toward shore. And falling into a place where two seas meet, they ran the ship aground. The forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land. And the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. Just like God said. Paul interceded and saved the prisoners' lives. They all would have been killed. God interceded. And they landed on a certain island. I remember when I was traveling ministry, I went to a church in Connecticut, and the pastor was from a country I really wasn't familiar with. He said he was from Malta. His name was Charlie Mixe. His brother, Joe, and Jenny, his wife, decided that they would go. And they told me, he says, we're going to go to the island where Paul's ship was destroyed. We're going to Malta. That's where Paul went. And God used him, and they were there for 3 months. They continued to have a great ministry. And then God sent them on to Rome, just like he said. Sometimes you're going to have to go through a storm. Sometimes you may have to be beaten. Sometimes people may falsely accuse you. Will you be faithful to God in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the persecution, in the midst of all of those trials, like Paul was? God has a purpose for you, and you're not going to go to heaven until you finish accomplishing that. And so in the middle of the storm, you can eat. And it's going to be hard. People are going to say, you can't have peace. But the greatest thing were the words Jesus said to his disciples in the midst of the storm one time, peace, be still. And the wind and waves were calmed by his voice. Peace, be still. And the miracle began by the voice of his command. Peace, be still. Heavenly Father, help us to realize you have a task for us. Help us to faithfully perform it and trust you. And share that message with the world out there that needs to hear.